From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I have the pleasure today of introducing Adam Goodheart, the author of the New York Times bestselling 1861. It is nothing short of mesmerizing. I'm a Civil War geek, and as a 12-year-old, I even subscribed to Civil War Times magazine. And when this book came out in April, I immediately downloaded it to my iPad, and I finished it in about 2 days. And this is not, he has a copy of the book, this is not a short book, this is a pretty thick book, but I couldn't put it down, I'm like zipping through it. And the reason of this is that he is not just a stellar storyteller and writer. And in authorship, there's an often underrated component, and that's research. Adam not only takes you down this road, this narrative path, but he populates the side streets, he populates the houses, he populates the people at the intersections. He makes it a living, breathing history. And I hope he tells you today about some of the larger-than-life figures that you may not even know existed at the beginning of the Civil War, and yet played a critical role in shaping the country and defining that conflict. He tells us the larger-than-life story of Elmer Ellsworth, the conflict's first casualty, and of young James Garfield, the future president, and of Major Benjamin Butler, whose lawyerly analysis led him to declare slaves as contraband and help recast the conflict as one about slavery and not just states' rights. Adam's an historian, a journalist, and a critic. He's a prolific contributor to the online Civil War series of the New York Times, and he's the director of the Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience at Washington College. He'll be signing his wonderful book at 3 p.m. wherever they sign books down there. And let's give him a warm introduction. And Adam.
Thanks, Del. And for those of you who haven't read Del's wonderful book about another critical moment in American history, ending with the numeral 1, I would definitely recommend that, about 1981. Thanks to all of you for coming out. You know, I'm always kind of surprised to see people coming to readings, especially this many people. There's an old French proverb that says, wanting to meet an author because you like his book is like wanting to meet a goose because you like foie gras. So, I don't know, I guess there are a lot of people who like geese out here, but I'll try to be more of a swan. I am just very grateful to the Library of Congress, not just for this incredible festival, but also for really letting me write my book. I practically moved into the main reading room of the Library of Congress for over 2 years while I was writing. In fact, I think the staff got a little bit worried about me. I realized at one point that I was kind of turning into one of those like strange old sort of unshaven guys walking around the library muttering to himself with these big plastic bags full of his research, and suddenly one day there wasn't a lot to separate me from that guy. If those of you, how many of you have been in the main reading room of the Library of Congress before? Well, it's just a remarkable and wonderful place to work. It's one of the most beautiful rooms in America and one of the most beautiful buildings in America. It's all decorated with statues, with frescoes of allegories and great authors of the past. And so I'd be sitting there with my laptop, and every time the temptation arose to check my email or daydream or something like that, I would look up and, you know, there were these larger than life-size figures of Herodotus and Gibbon saying, "Get back to work!" Yes, okay. I would cower there in desk number 12, my favorite desk, and get back to writing. It's a place also, the Library of Congress, of these sort of magnificent and startling encounters with the past that can sort of come out and ambush you at any moment. One of these moments happened for me in the manuscript reading room at the library, a place where they have collections of almost every American president's papers, along with papers of many Americans more obscure. One of whom was a man named Major Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson was the commander of the little Union force occupying Fort Sumter just as the Civil War was preparing to begin. His little Union force was besieged. It was about 60 soldiers and a brass band, besieged by thousands of pro-rebel militiamen. And they were just waiting for the moment when the inevitable, it seemed, attack would come. And so I was looking through Anderson's papers, and in his papers I found this little lavender sheet of very fancy note paper, a sheet of paper that had been delivered to him from Major General P.G.T. Beauregard. Beauregard was actually Anderson's old pupil from West Point. Anderson was an artillery instructor at West Point and had actually taught Beauregard, who was a star pupil. And then Beauregard had gone off to join the rebels and was in fact commanding the rebel forces at Fort Sumter. And so there's this little lavender sheet of notepaper, and written on it, it said, Charleston Harbor, 3:20 a.m., April 12th, 1861. Sir, on behalf of Major General Beauregard, Commander, Provisional Army, Confederate States of America, we have the honor to inform you that the firing will commence in exactly 1 hour. And it was signed by a couple of Beauregard's aides. And I just held this piece of paper and I said, my God, this is the piece of paper that started the Civil War. And actually I took it up and I showed it to one of the librarians in the manuscript room and said, oh, I didn't know we had this actually. I guess we should do something with it, maybe put it on display or something like that. So I was looking at this piece of paper, and what was remarkable about it wasn't just the words that were written on it, but it was also the artifact itself, because you could see this very sort of fancy, creamy sheet of blue notepaper that looked as though it were more suited to, you know, write a love letter or an invitation to a dinner party than the announcement of an artillery barrage. And you could see a little fold, a place where the paper had been folded, and I knew that that was the place where it had been folded between the fingers of this Confederate adjutant as he stepped off the launch in the middle of the night onto the wharf at Fort Sumter and handed this incredibly momentous piece of paper, this piece of paper that would change American history, over to the Union commander. And suddenly that moment was very, very vivid. I think that for a historian, the job of any historian is to try to bring his readers into that sort of a moment, into that sort of experience when the past is suddenly and startlingly present. And it's a difficult task creating such moments. It's a sort of an elusive thing, another world, a parallel reality that you're constantly trying to find your way into. It's sort of like in the Harry Potter novels when he goes to the train station. Is it platform 9 3/4? Is that the one? He's trying to get to platform 9 3/4. I feel like as a historian you're always trying to get to that portal. And it's especially difficult with the Civil War because it's history that seems so familiar to us, because it's history that we think we already know. It's very hard to peel away, especially as I tried to do in my book 1861, and recreate the first moments, the first days and weeks and months of that incredible drama in American history. Because our understanding of that time is just overshadowed by our knowledge of what would come later. It's overshadowed especially by a litany of battles, these names of battles that we're all familiar with from our history classes. First Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, this sort of litany of the war. And it can be hard to strip that away. Now, to me, I think like anyone who loves American history, I'd always been fascinated. Part of me had always been fascinated by the Civil War since I was a kid, as Del just said. But it was a very particular part of the Civil War that fascinated me. When I was in 8th grade, I took a class trip to Gettysburg. How many of you took class trips to Gettysburg when you were growing up? Well, those of you who took trips probably remember there was this electronic map. Do you remember this thing inside the visitor center? You went in, there's this sort of big contour map that shows you the Battle of Gettysburg and narrates. There's a disembodied sort of 1950s narrator voice that's narrating the Battle of Gettysburg as these little red and blue lights move across the map. So this disembodied voice says, "And the Union charged up Culp's Hill." And you see these blue lights going boop, 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 boop. And then the voice intones, "And the Confederacy counterattacked." And you see these red lights, boop, 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 boop. And now, please, there's probably somebody out there in the audience who's a big Civil War buff who's saying, it wasn't the Union that attacked Culp's Hill, it wasn't the Confederacy that counterattacked. Please, that's the kind of stuff that I, frankly, can't ever remember. I can't ever keep track of whose cavalry counterattacked whose cavalry. But instead, the Civil War that I've always been interested in has been this sort of Civil War of incredible songs, incredible individual stories in letters, in diaries, in newspaper articles, poems, and these haunted, youthful faces staring back at us across death, across the gulf of a century and a half of history from the worn surfaces of tintype photographs. That's the Civil War that has always enthralled me. But that's not usually how history is presented. It's more often told as, well, what one great historian of the 19th century, David Davis of Yale, called America's great 19th century Super Bowl. These sort of, arrows and circles on the map. Or it's told as academic history. It's told as the history of these unified groups, the North, the South, the slaves, the immigrants, each moving sort of in lockstep march according to a set of socioeconomic and ideological rules. And I think that each of those views misses a lot. I think that even our understanding of the Civil War has been obscured by something that Walt Whitman, ironically enough, called the real war. Whitman very famously wrote, "The real war will never make it into the history books." And when he said that, what he meant was, all we will remember is the glory of the battles. We won't remember the mud and the blood and the suffering, the things that I saw in Washington, D.C., in the hospitals among the wounded. But if anything, I think, and I shouldn't name names, but in some of the books and documentaries that we've seen in recent years, recent decades of the Civil War, it dwells so much on the mud and the blood and the suffering that it obscures some of the other things. The Civil War that I like is the one that was discovered exactly 50 years ago this year by an unlikely person, a scruffy young man from Minnesota who took the bus to New York City trying to make a career as a musician. And in his long stints between paying gigs or unpaying gigs, this young man, Bobby Zimmerman, of course, we know him as Bob Dylan, would go to the New York Public Library and would call up microfilm reels of Civil War newspapers and would pore over these volumes obsessively, volumes from exactly 100 years ago, volumes from the spring of 1861. And he later said that what drew him in was the weird mind philosophies turned on their heads and the epic bearded characters. I just love that, epic bearded characters. I think we all know what Dylan meant. And he said that these things became the all-encompassing template between everything that he wrote as a composer, as a musician. And so that's the kind of Civil War experience that I've tried to evoke. Now, my book, my own journey into 1861, began not at Gettysburg, not at Antietam, not on one of these battlefields, but very far away on the eastern shore of Maryland, just across Chesapeake from here, near the college where I teach, Washington College. Began in the attic of an old plantation house, a farm that's been in the same family for a very long time, even by the standards of the eastern shore of Maryland, where families tend to hang on for very long. This farm has been in one family for 350 years. And I often would take my students there, my history students, to this old house to step back in time and explore this old plantation that hasn't been lived in decades. We knew that there were old letters, old family papers in the house. We'd seen them in the attic, stuffed into barrels and boxes and old lard cans, all willy-nilly. But we hadn't ever really explored them. And one spring I was there several years ago with a group of students. We were poking around in the house, and one of my students became especially fascinated with these family papers. There was an old story, an old oral tradition in this family that something interesting had happened in the spring of 1861. Something interesting had happened as the Civil War began, that there was a member of the family who was a major in the US Army and who had to decide which side he was going to go with in the Civil War as it began. And this was a great drama for him and a great drama for the family. So we'd heard this story, and I guess, can I take this name tag off, since I guess you guys know who I am? Something about name tags. Anyway, this major was trying to decide which side to join. We'd heard this story from the oral history of the family. One of my students became especially fascinated by this story. A student of mine who actually is an ex-Marine. He was a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, fascinated with military history. And he said to me, I want to do my term paper on this story, and I want to find it in the papers in this attic. So I said, wow, that's a tall order, you know, for a freshman term paper. First of all, it's about 150 degrees up here in this attic. It was the end of the spring semester. Second of all, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of papers up here. No rhyme or reason to them at all. And eventually, when we did explore them further, it would turn out there were 30,000 pages of documents, stretching from canceled checks from the 1960s all the way back to these sort of spidery land deeds. The oldest piece of paper that we found was from 1663. And I said, there is no guarantee, Jim, that you're going to find anything in this attic about this major, let alone about what was going on in the spring of 1861. He said, I don't care. You know, being a Marine, he's very persistent. I don't care. I want to come up here and find it. So I said, okay, I'll come back with you for a couple of hours on Sunday morning. We'll poke around. We came back. We started digging. And one of the very first things that we pulled out of that attic was a little bundle of papers tied up in a yellow silk ribbon that clearly hadn't been undone in over a century. And written on the outside were the words, Major Emery's letters regarding his resignation from the US Army, 1861. And I just said, wow. And then I handed this bundle and I said, Jim, one thing you should know as a budding historian, it's not always this easy. But that morning, somehow it seemed to be. And what we found in that bundle was a very personal, a very private story of a man who felt loyalty to his country, loyalty to this flag that he had served ever since he was a 14-year-old enrolling as a cadet at West Point, followed this flag through the war in Mexico. And now here he was, as this great national crisis unfolded in early 1861, stationed in a fort in the remote Indian Territory, what's now Oklahoma, getting these sort of scattershot reports from back east about what was happening. On the one hand, he felt that he was a loyal Southerner as a Marylander, came from a slaveholding background, although he felt also qualms and pangs of abolitionist feeling, he would later claim. He was a good friend of Jefferson Davis. His family actually was so close to Davis that his son was actually living with the Davis family at the time. So he felt these contradictory tugs, but he was also thinking about much more personal things. He was thinking about things like, what will this mean to my career, to the future of my family? Will I be hailed as a patriot, a founder of this great new American republic, much as our grandparents' generation was after the Revolution? Or will I be literally strung up from a tree as a traitor? And there was one particular letter that really grabbed me. It was a letter from his wife. His wife was actually a Northerner. She was from Philadelphia. She was the great-granddaughter of Benjamin Franklin, no less. And you don't get much more Philadelphian than that, I can tell you as a Philadelphian myself. And yet, you know, like many spouses, Mrs. Emery was a pragmatic person. And so basically she was saying, you know, honey, if you decide to go with the South, if you think it's best for your career, that's all right, I'm ready to do that, I'm cool with that. And she wrote in this letter, she said, it is like a great game of chance. It's like a great game of chance. Those words sort of leapt off the page and grabbed me. They brought to life this moment when nothing was certain, when the only thing sure was insecurity, uncertainty itself. And I decided that I would write a book that would try to bring those things to life, the people, the places, the stories. Now, as I mentioned, I wrote nearly all of the book here in Washington, and stepping into the past, stepping into that secret railway platform into history, I think is especially easy here in Washington, D.C. And for the rest of my time up here, before I take a few questions, I'd like to try to bring you into that moment of Washington in the spring of 1861. Now, I would step out from a long day of research in the Library of Congress, come down the front steps of the Jefferson Building, and right there in front of me was the east front of the United States Capitol. Right there I was standing in the scene, one of the great scenes of several of the acts of my book. The place where I had just been reading about the soldiers, the young soldiers from New York, the fire Swabs, in the spring of 1861, playing baseball together underneath the flowering horse chestnut trees by the Capitol before they marched off together as one of the first regiments, the first Union regiments to cross into Virginia. It was also the place where Abraham Lincoln gave his famous first inaugural address, where he spoke his famous and prophetic words, the mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield to every patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. And those words would come almost echoing to me across this space, just across the street. Now, those of you who are sitting in the front rows, I think, can actually see. Can some of you over here see the dome of the Capitol sort of looming up almost literally over my shoulder? And of course, if you were on this spot in the spring of 1861, that view wouldn't have been exactly the view that you see today, because it was an unfinished dome, this famously unfinished Capitol that seemed to represent somehow the incomplete federal union itself. Now, Washington in those days was very much an uncompleted city. It was sort of like a third world capital today. For those of you who have been to a place like, Dhaka, Bangladesh, or Lagos, Nigeria, these are places where you get, it's a sort of an almost a great, vast, overgrown, sprawling village with shacks and open sewage canals, and then a few sort of luxury high-rise hotels and gleaming marble government buildings rising in the midst of the squalor. That was Washington, D.C. in 1861. And in fact, this spot where we're now sitting was not a green and manicured space as it is today, but it was a sort of the National Mall was a great muddy field with grazing cattle, with the stench of raw sewage coming from a canal that ran right over there. I mean, if we were here, it would have been extremely pungent, because just about 50 yards away was what they called the Tiber Canal, the great sewage canal of Washington, literally a sort of a miasma. And it was such a dangerous thing in those days, this Tiber Canal, that one morning in early 1861, a gentleman was driving his carriage nearby along 2nd Street when literally a section of 2nd Street collapsed into the canal and sank this gentleman and his carriage, and he drowned in the raw sewage of the canal. So anyway, if you think that Washington is full of raw sewage today, perhaps also emanating from that building at the other end of the mall. Trust me, it was worse. But this place in the spring of 1861, if it was in some ways so raw, so unfinished that in itself it was a kind of tacit argument against the very idea that a federal government could exist, it very quickly started to change. If you'd been here on this spot that spring, you would have seen troops drilling, troops in strange, unprecedented new uniforms. You would have seen these fire Swabs, the New York City firemen who had been recruited and dressed improbably enough in these great big baggy red sort of harem pants and wore little red fezzes on their heads like North African soldiers. You would have seen the Garibaldi Guard, who were these sort of self-consciously very European soldiers. I guess, you know, in those days, this sort of idea of the French and Italians as the surrender monkeys hadn't really taken hold in the same way that it seemed to in a recent war. The French and the Italians were thought of as very proud, warlike people, and so this regiment came to war dressed in these sort of jaunty green Italian bersaglieri caps, carrying the Italian tricolor. And my favorite detail of all was that every man on the end of his bayonet, on his rifle, carried a baguette speared, because that was how the French troops were supposed to march off into battle. This was also a city of slavery in the spring of 1861. It's something that not a lot of people think about today. When they think of Washington, we think of it as the Union capital, but in fact it was also, in some respects, a capital of slavery. Not too many blocks from here, just across Pennsylvania Avenue, were auction houses, the old auction house district of Washington, where you could find, along with real estate and household items, men and women and children being auctioned off. In fact, literally the day that those words that I just recounted to you, Abraham Lincoln's words at his first inaugural, appeared in the newspapers, alongside them appeared ads from a man coming to Washington from Louisiana seeking to purchase slaves for his sugar plantations. And in fact, Lincoln himself had been awakened to some of the realities of slavery here in Washington. This is an almost completely forgotten story about Lincoln. As a young congressman in the late 1840s during the Mexican War, he lived here in a boarding house on Capitol Hill. And in this boarding house, where he lived with other congressmen and senators, several slaves worked, slaves who were hired out by their masters. And several free blacks worked there as well. And there was one particular man, a waiter in this boarding house, who was a fugitive slave. And one day in early that spring, slave catchers came, seized this man from the boarding house where Lincoln was living, and kidnapped him back into slavery. So Lincoln had had an up-close experience himself with the horrors of slavery. It was right after that Congressman Lincoln introduced a bill unsuccessfully to ban slavery in the District of Columbia. So he'd had his own experiences with slavery here. But I found great characters here at that moment in time, great people whose stories I tried to evoke. There are so many, I'll just tell you about three before I take questions. One of them was Louis T. Wigfall. I love these 19th century names. You just don't find names like that in the present. Who would name their kid today Louis T. Wigfall? But Louis T. Wigfall was a United States senator. He was one of the most fire-breathing, pro-slavery, pro-secession senators. A classic Deep South Southerner, classic Texan, in fact. By the age of 25, he had managed to squander a considerable inheritance. He had managed to settle 3 affairs of honor on the dueling ground with pistols. He had fought in a ruthless campaign against the Seminole Indians. He had won an enviable reputation in whorehouses throughout the South and consumed a small lake full of bourbon, and finally gotten hauled before a judge on charges of murder. Now, of course, this resume made him very well qualified for public life, and so he took the next logical step and went into Texas politics. How many of you are from Texas here? Well, if any Bowie knives come flying at me. And Wigfall disdained the very idea of compromise. He stood up in the Senate and he would stand up and give these hazy speeches, sort of speaking slurred by bourbon, lasting sometimes until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And while he was still a U.S. Senator, Texas seceded, but he decided he was just going to sort of hang around like the sort of last drunken guest at a dinner party and keep fulminating against the North, which he did at great length. He insisted that this coming conflict would end in a few weeks' time when the South stormed into Boston and the North was forced to sign its final articles of surrender in Faneuil Hall itself. Didn't exactly happen. And this man, Louis Wigfall, improbably enough, would become, as very few people know, the very man to whom Fort Sumter surrendered in April of 1861. There was the second character that I wanted to tell you about, Elmer Ellsworth, the flamboyant young militia officer, friend of Abraham Lincoln, who came out of Chicago, who created this sort of militia, this military craze, even before the Civil War began, known as the Swabs. And the Swabs were these soldiers based, as I said a few moments ago, on sort of North African elite troops who went into battle with fezzes, and also were renowned for performing this very special kind of military drill. You know, these were the days when soldiers often went into battle sort of marching like this, turning in straight lines. Well, the Swabs would turn somersaults and leap in the air and swirl their rifles around and lunge with their bayonets. They were sort of like a cross between SEAL Team 6 and the Cirque du Soleil. That was the Swabs. And so Ellsworth had actually taken these Swabs on a tour of America. He formed a regiment and took them on a tour of America the summer before the Civil War even began. It became a great craze. He was this sort of rock star, this sex symbol of the antebellum world. And then when the war began, he recruited a regiment of New York City firemen to serve as Swabs, brought them to Washington, D.C., and in the first weeks of the Civil War, you could have found these men camped out in the United States Capitol, literally sleeping beneath this great interrupted dome of the rotunda, sleeping in the Senate chamber itself where they found Jefferson Davis's desk and hacked it to pieces, and literally climbing like monkeys, one observer said, up the scaffolding and swinging from ropes in the Capitol dome. And finally, perhaps the most compelling character of all was the man who arrived here in Washington from Springfield, Illinois, early on the morning of February 23rd, 1861, the day after Washington's birthday, sneaking into the city literally incognito and under cover of darkness, after giving a series of speeches as he crossed the country on his way to the presidency, making these whistle stops in which he tried to address the crisis facing the nation and ended up completely putting his foot in his mouth, ending up increasingly ridiculed. So he sort of bumbled and stumbled and sneaked his way into the presidency. He had come from farther away than any president before him. He had come with less experience in public life than any president before him, a single term in Congress, and he hadn't even set foot in the capital city in more than a decade. He was underestimated by most ordinary Americans north and south. He was underestimated by the leaders of the rebel government, by his own cabinet, and I think Lincoln was even underestimated by himself. Those extraordinary months in the spring of 1861 would transform Abraham Lincoln. They would forever change the nation, alter the course of millions of lives, as well as change the destinies of millions yet unborn, including all of us in this tent today. So that's the story that I tried to capture, and that's the story that I'll take some questions about for the next few minutes if you have some to ask. Yes, sir.
Thank you. As a more generic question, as a historian,
Yes.
you describe your time in the Library of Congress, you describe attics and finding letters.
Yes.
In this day of Twitter, of using the thumb, the lack of letters, email, what is the future in being able to tell stories of the past?
Well, you know, in some ways we're richer than we were, or historians who will tell about the year 2011 are richer than the ones who narrate the year 1861. I mean, what wouldn't we give to see a film of Abraham Lincoln giving that inaugural address, or even a recording of his voice? You know, there's a sort of an unsubstantiated story that Lincoln's voice may have been recorded during his presidency. I don't know if you know about this, but actually a librarian at the Library of Congress told me about this years ago. I've been fascinated ever since, that apparently there was an inventor who was working on this sort of pioneering means of recording voices, who supposedly went to the White House and recorded Abraham Lincoln, and this recording is lost. Actually, a few years ago, you may remember, there was a recording made in 1860, a year before Lincoln became president, using this method that was actually reconstructed and played for the first time. So I don't know about you, but I would give a lot for that recording of Lincoln's voice. On the other hand, I do feel like we'll miss out a lot on the voices of the 1860s, the voices of 19th century America. It was one of those moments in history, it was a moment in history when even not just the preachers, the orators, the politicians, but ordinary men and women, ordinary soldiers, seemed to have this great gift for language. I think it was this sort of perfect intersection of rising rates of literacy and education with a moment when our brains hadn't all been sort of injected with this pop culture styrofoam that fill them today. People in those days, they read Shakespeare, they read Byron, they read the King James Bible, and their heads were full of that when they sat down to write. And I don't think that the emails, let alone the tweets of today, will have the same richness for historians. Yes.
Is it working?
Yes,
okay.
It's on.
You write in your book vividly and intimately about a great many people. You spent years delving into their lives. How often or how much did you feel that you had discovered people who were a great deal like yourself or ourselves, modern people of today?
Yeah.
Or did they forever mostly remain a bit beyond reach, kind of mysterious and not able to fully grasp?
Well, it's a terrific question. And actually, not surprisingly, the man who asked this question is Fergus Bordewick, who himself is a great historian, wrote the greatest history of the Underground Railroad, I think, ever to be published. So he knows well what it's like. You know, yes. It's a great book. You know, it's so strange that when you're a historian, when you're reading about these people in the past, at one moment you'll be shocked by this immediate sense of how much you have in common with them, how much just like people of the 21st century, people of the 19th were. And then the next moment it'll be the opposite, and you'll feel like you're looking at these people across a great gulf of strangeness. And I think that's true of just about every moment in the past that we can read about. That said, I did find characters who felt very present to me, experiences that felt very present to me. And I think I was actually shaped, I think every historian is shaped by the moment of history that he or she lives in. And when I read the description of men and women and children on the afternoon of Sumter's surrender, April 13th, 1861, crowding the rooftops of Charleston, looking out and seeing the smoke rising from Fort Sumter as if a volcano had erupted in the center of Charleston Harbor, looking at this and wondering what it meant for the future of themselves, their families, their country, I couldn't help but think of that other morning, almost exactly 140 years later, when I stood outside my house on 15th Street in Washington, D.C., in a crowd of strangers, looking southward, looking across the mall here, and seeing the column of smoke rising from the burning Pentagon as we wondered what that would mean for the future of our country. And so I think those are the kinds of moments that, that do bring these people very vividly to life. I also, I tend to like the characters who aren't simple heroes or villains, but rather the characters who grapple with themselves, who grapple with right and wrong, and who are sort of in the middle. Those are the people I try to find and write about.
This is a similar question. I guess I'm curious, in what ways do you think that looking at narratives and stories of individuals as opposed to like historical data and research can inform our understanding of people and events today?
Well, I think it's always tricky to try to take direct lessons. And a lot of people, as I've been going around speaking about my book, will ask me, well, don't you think that the politics of today are just like they were in the 1860s? We have a divided country, people are shouting and yelling at each other, there's no civility, no respect, and it's so polarized, isn't it getting to be now just like it was then? And I have to say, no. Our congressmen may be yelling at each other, but they're not pointing revolvers on the floor of Congress yet. They're not beating each other silly with canes. We don't have people drilling in the streets preparing to fight a war against their fellow Americans. So I think those parallels are tricky. I do think that in a larger sense, history teaches us by teaching us more broadly about the human condition, about how individual lives intersect with and are changed by, and occasionally how we as individuals can courageously or occasionally in cowardly ways change the course of our country, the course of larger history. Yes, sir.
Do you know when slavery and slave trading actually ended in the district?
Yeah, slavery actually was abolished in the district in 1862. So it was 1 year into the Civil War, and actually, it's interesting because slave trading, most of the country thought was abolished by the Compromise of 1850. In fact, it had been one of the main concession points of the South to the North, part of this sort of elaborate horse trading deal. But in fact, what that compromise did was only to say that slaves couldn't be brought through the district for the purposes of being sold out of state. And so it was perfectly legal for someone to take a slave and put him or her up for sale within the district, and there were all kinds of ways to avoid the law. So it actually changed very little about slave trading in this city. I mean, it was chilling to me to read these stories about people being put up on auction blocks on places familiar to me in my own city, to read stories of, it was a familiar sight if you lived in Washington, to have a woman knock on your door, a free black woman begging for pennies or dimes to buy her children out of slavery. So this was very much present, and in fact, when Lincoln came and gave his first address in Washington, when he arrived as president-elect, he stood outside, again, just a couple of blocks from here, what's now the Willard Hotel, and he said, "I'm very conscious that for the first time in this phase of my public life, I'm speaking in a place where slavery exists and is honored." I think we have time for one last question.
Mine is not a question, it's more of a commentary. There may not be Ellsworths or Wigfalls in here, but we're grateful that there's a Goodheart here. And I think don't underestimate the lack of knowledge that we have about the Civil War. I think our younger people are being brought up to respond to standardized tests, and maybe don't have the intellectual curiosity that you and your students have. So I applaud you for doing all the research that you've done and presenting and making the Civil War seem all that much more real to us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks to all of you, and I hope I have a chance to meet some of you shortly. I have to hustle back to the book signing tent and set up shop. Thanks again.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.